Some women are born strong. Others are made strong by the things that happen to them. The difference is that the second kind knows exactly what strength costs. Sarah Anne Calloway was the second kind. She'd grown up soft and safe in a good home in Tennessee, the daughter of a schoolteacher and a gentle mother who pressed wildflowers in her Bible and hummed hymns while she cooked. At 19, Sarah married James Calloway, a quiet, broad-shouldered man with honest hands and a dream about land in Kansas. She followed him west with just a trunk of clothes, a cast-iron skillet, and the absolute certainty that love was enough to build a life on. For 6 years, it had been. Their farm outside Clearwater, Kansas, sat on 40 acres of good flat land. A creek ran along the eastern edge, under a sky so wide and blue it made you feel like God was paying attention. They had a barn, a garden, 2 horses, and a 4-year-old daughter named Grace, who had her father's quiet eyes and her mother's stubborn mouth. It wasn't a grand life. It was better. It was a real one. Then, on a Thursday morning in the spring of 1869, everything changed. While James was in town filing papers at the land office, a man named Silas Dredd rode onto the Calloway farm with 6 men behind him. Silas Dredd was not a complicated man. He wanted the Calloway land because of that creek, the only reliable water source for 20 miles in any direction. And Silas Dredd believed that what was useful to others belonged, by right, to him. He'd come before, twice, with offers that were really instructions. James had refused, politely but completely. He wrote to the county sheriff and the land office, but the letters produced no results. Silas Dredd had already spoken to them in his own particular language, money and the suggestion of violence. So on that Thursday morning, Silas Dredd came a 3rd time. This time he didn't make an offer. He made an example. Sarah watched from the doorway, Grace pressed behind her legs, as Dredd's men went to the barn. The fire started so fast it was like a magic trick. One moment, there was timber and hay. The next, a roar of orange and black ate the whole structure in minutes. She ran. She ran for Grace, ran for the creek, ran the way an animal runs when it knows that stopping means dying. She heard the house go up in flames behind her, but didn't look back. She plunged through the creek, water up to her knees, Grace tight in her arms, the fire reflecting on the water all around her. She didn't stop until the sound of it was a memory and the smell of it was burned into her hair, her skin, her soul. She understood with a terrible clarity that she would never stop smelling it for the rest of her life. James returned from town to find the farm in ashes and his family gone. He left everything he had ever owned in the ruins and rode hard for 3 days, following the creek north. He knew his wife. He knew she would follow the water. He found them sheltering in an abandoned soddy 8 miles north. Sarah, with her arms around Grace, both wrapped in a horse blanket a passing trader had given them. They were alive, cold, and entirely unbroken in a way James recognized immediately as something new in his wife. Something that wasn't there before the fire and would never leave her now. He held them both for a long time without speaking. Then he said, "We will go to the sheriff." Sarah looked at him over Grace's head with those new, hard eyes. "The sheriff will not help us, James," she said quietly. "We both know it." James looked at her for a moment. "And we go to the federal marshal in Wichita. We have the deed. We have the law on our side." Sarah said nothing. She was already beginning to understand something James hadn't yet learned. That the law and the side it was on were 2 different things. And Silas Dredd understood that better than either of them. But she loved her husband, and she trusted his goodness even when she'd stopped trusting the world's. So she said nothing more that night. 3 weeks later, James Calloway rode into Clearwater to file a formal complaint with the federal land office. He was found the next morning, face down in the same creek that ran along the edge of what had been their farm. The verdict was accidental drowning. Sarah Anne Calloway stood at his grave on a cold April morning, Grace's hand in hers, the wind cutting across the flat Kansas plain. She understood she had 2 choices. She could lie down and let Silas Dredd win. She picked up Grace. She walked away from the grave. She did not look back. She had never been the looking back kind, not really. Had never been the looking back kind, not really. Not underneath the soft Tennessee girlhood and the quiet farm life, and the love that had made her briefly believe the world was gentler than it was. Silas Dredd had burned all of that away. What was left was something older, harder, and considerably more dangerous. And it was just getting started. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to like and subscribe for more tales of resilience and the untamed human spirit. We'll see you in the next one. She left Clearwater on a gray April morning with Grace on her hip and $14 sewn into the hem of her skirt. She also carried a rifle, the one thing she'd saved from the fire. The one thing Silas Dredd's men hadn't touched before she ran. She didn't have a plan, just a direction. South. South toward Indian Territory. A place where she'd heard a woman with enough nerve and nothing left to lose could disappear completely. Grace was quiet on the journey. Children can be like that when they sense the adults around them are stretched to their absolute limit. She wasn't crying or asking questions. She just watched her mother with those steady, dark eyes. Occasionally, she'd press her small face against Sarah's shoulder, as if to say, "I am here." And that was the most useful thing anyone had said to Sarah since James died. For the first 2 days, they walked. Just outside of Newton, a farmer's wife gave them a ride in her wagon, taking them as far as Wichita. She didn't ask any questions. Sarah understood this as an act of grace from one woman to another. The kind of help that doesn't need explaining because the need is written so plainly on a person's face. In Wichita, Sarah spent 3 of her precious $14. She got them 2 nights in a boarding house, a warm meal, and a second-hand pair of boots for Grace, whose own had worn clean through on the right sole. After that, she kept moving. She knew Silas Dredd. He hadn't built his empire by letting loose ends stay loose. She could feel him behind her, the same way you can feel an approaching storm. You can't see it yet, but you know in your bones that it's coming. And she was right. Silas Dredd had sent a man after her. His name was Cotton Briggs, a tracker, a professional. A man who had spent 20 years finding people who didn't want to be found and returning them to whoever was paying. He never asked what happened after the returning. Cotton Briggs wasn't cruel in the way Silas Dredd was. He didn't enjoy it. He didn't take any satisfaction in the fear he caused. He was simply, utterly without feeling in either direction. In some ways, that made him even more dangerous. He picked up Sarah's trail in Clearwater less than a week after she fled and followed it south with the patient. Methodical efficiency of a man who had never once failed to find what he was looking for. He was 3 days behind her when she reached Wichita. 2 days behind her by the time she crossed into Indian Territory, and he was gaining. The reason was simple and relentless. Sarah was traveling with a child, and he was traveling alone. The math was not in her favor. Sarah didn't know his name yet. She didn't know his face. But she felt his presence behind her like a cold hand pressed between her shoulder blades. And in the past month, she had learned to trust her feelings. Everything she had ignored before the fire had turned out to be exactly as dangerous as her intuition had warned. Help arrived in the last place she ever expected. It came from a Chickasaw woman named Adaze, who ran a small trading post at the edge of a creek crossing deep in Indian Territory. Adaze was a broad-shouldered woman, maybe 50 years old, with sharp eyes and the direct, unadorned manner of someone who had seen enough of the world to stop being surprised by most of it. When Sarah and Grace stepped through the door, Adaze looked at them for a long moment. She took in the rifle, the worn boots, and the careful way Sarah positioned herself so she could see both the door and the window at the same time. Then she spoke, her voice calm and simple. "How long has someone been following you?" Sarah just stared at her, stunned. Finally, she managed to reply, "I do not know his name." Adaze nodded, as if this were the most ordinary thing in the world. She gave them both a meal, settled Grace with a blanket by the fire, and then sat across from Sarah with 2 cups of coffee. And what she told her next changed the entire shape of what Sarah had been doing. "Running," Adaze said, her voice steady, "only works until it stops working. And it always stops working, eventually. Because the person running is always thinking about where they are going. And the person chasing is always thinking about where you are going too." She paused, letting the words sink in. "The only moment a hunted person is ever truly safe is the moment they stop being the one who is hunted." Sarah looked at her over the rim of her coffee cup. "You mean stop running," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Adiz's gaze was unwavering. "I mean choose the ground," she said. "Choose it yourself. Before he does." That idea, so simple yet so powerful, began to take root in Sarah's mind. For weeks, she had been the prey, reacting, fleeing, always looking over her shoulder. The thought of turning, of choosing her own battlefield, was terrifying, but it was also liberating. It was the first spark of control she had felt since the fire. It was the first time she wasn't just thinking about surviving, but about winning. The hunter becoming the hunted. This was no longer just a flight for safety. It was the beginning of a fight for her life on her own terms. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next video. 3 days, that's all it took. Not on the outside, but deep within, like a river that finally finds its true course. She learned to read a trail not just by footprints, but by the subtle signs of fear and haste. She learned how to use the terrain as an ally, the creek crossings that masked ascent, the high ground that offered a commanding view, the narrow passes where one person could hold off 10. She learned a stillness that made her almost invisible, a skill her ancestors had perfected, a knowledge the world had tried to forget. Her daughter, Grace, watched silently from her blanket, her dark eyes missing nothing. And Sarah, looking at her in the quiet evenings, knew she was doing all this for her. For a future where her daughter's mother didn't just lie down and accept defeat. On the third morning, Sarah asked Adaze the crucial question. Where's the best ground? Adaze knew the place. 20 miles southeast, where a creek wrapped around a limestone bluff. It had one narrow approach and clear sightlines in every direction. It was a fortress made by nature, belonging to whoever got there first and understood its power. Before sunrise, Sarah was in the saddle. She kissed Grace goodbye, leaving her in Adaze's care. Her heart filled with the unshakable certainty of a decision made. 2 days later, the tracker, Cotton Briggs, arrived at the trading post. He was a professional, masking his frustration, but Adaze saw it in the tightening of his jaw, the way his eyes scanned the room, calculating. He asked his questions, direct and efficient. Adaze, a master of deflection, offered him tea and told him nothing of value, all with the most helpful demeanor imaginable. Sarah wasn't running anymore. She was waiting. She had reached the limestone bluff before dawn, spending an entire day memorizing its every feature. Every shadow, every approach, every patch of ground that would betray a careless step. She even knew when he would arrive, having calculated his speed and the distance. And for the first time since the fire, she wasn't afraid. The constant, low hum of fear that had become her shadow was gone. Sitting on that bluff, rifle across her knees, watching the Texas sky turn pink, she felt something new. The power of choice. Just as she predicted, Cotton Briggs rode into the narrow approach mid-morning. He stopped abruptly when her voice echoed down from the bluff, clear and calm. She paused, letting the words hang in the still air. I am not running anymore. You can go back and tell Silas Dredd that. Or you can try to finish your job. Cotton Briggs sat frozen on his horse. He was a professional, and professionals make calculations. The equation was simple. A woman with the high ground, a rifle, and nothing to lose. It was the most dangerous combination in the world, and he knew it. He stared up at the bluff for a long, silent moment. Then, without a word, he turned his horse around and rode back the way he came, never once looking back. She felt a tension release inside her, a knot she didn't even know she was holding. It wasn't over. She was no longer the hunted. She was something else now. Something new. Thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe for the final chapter of Sarah's story. Silas Dredd, a man carved from pure, unyielding certainty, rode in on a Wednesday morning. He brought 5 men with him, a small army trailing in his dust. For Silas, every problem he'd ever faced had buckled under the weight of his money or the blunt force of his will. He'd built his entire empire on that simple, brutal truth. But there were things Silas Dredd didn't know. He didn't know about Adaze, a presence as old and steady as the earth itself. He didn't know about the limestone bluff that jutted from the land like a hawk's perch. And most importantly, he didn't know that Sarah had spent the last 3 weeks committing every rock, every dip, every shadow of this land to memory. She'd learned it the way a desperate person learns a prayer. The way you learn something when your very life depends on knowing it completely, intimately, without a single hesitation. All Silas Dredd knew was that his hired gun, the infamous Cotton Briggs, had returned empty-handed. Briggs had not only failed to finish the job, but had vanished from the territory altogether. This was a first. In 20 years, Cotton Briggs had never walked away from a contract. That fact alone should have been a red flag, a screaming siren in the quiet morning air, telling Silas that something here was different, something was wrong. But it didn't. The message was lost on him, drowned out by the thunder of his own arrogance. And so he rode on, deeper into the trap. Sarah saw them from 2 miles out. They were just dark specks on the horizon at first, a slow-crawling threat against the vast open land. But she knew who they were. She had been waiting. Her daughter, Grace, was already safe, tucked away with Otis, far from the coming storm. Now it was just Sarah, alone on the bluff. She felt the familiar weight of her rifle in her hands, the cold reality of the 6 rounds she possessed. 6 shots, that was all she had. But she also had something more valuable, an unshakable knowledge of the ground beneath her feet. And somewhere in the crucible of the past 3 weeks, a new kind of certainty had been forged within her, burning away the last vestiges of fear. She wasn't afraid anymore. She was ready. On paper, the odds were a joke. 5 heavily armed men against 1 woman with a rifle. It was a slaughter waiting to happen. But Sarah had stopped thinking in those terms. She had stopped measuring her chances by their standards, by their numbers. The conventional arithmetic of a fight didn't apply here. This wasn't a battle of numbers. It was a battle of position, of strategy, of ground. The question was never about how many men he brought. The question was always about the land itself. And Silas Dread, blinded by his own power, was riding directly into the only possible approach to the bluff. It was a narrow passage, a bottleneck carved by time and water, where 5 men couldn't ride side by side. They would have to come through in single file, a slow, vulnerable procession. And in that instant, the math changed. The equation flipped entirely. Suddenly, it wasn't 5 men against 1 woman anymore. It was 1 man, and then another, each one alone, facing a woman who held the high ground. A woman who was above them, watching, waiting. A woman who had already lost everything she thought she could lose. And in doing so, had become something far more dangerous than any of them could ever imagine. They were riding into her world now, and she was ready. She watched them get closer, feeling the cool stone of the bluff at her back and the unwavering resolve in her heart. The first rider entered the passage. The fight had begun. This wasn't just a defense of her land. It was a reclamation of her life, fought on her terms, on her ground. She was no longer the prey. She was the hunter, and they had just walked into her snare. The wind whistled through the canyon, carrying the scent of dust and the quiet promise of what was to come. Silas Dread had built his life on certainty. But he was about to learn that Sarah had found a certainty of her own, one that was harder than stone and more relentless than any force he had ever commanded. She raised the rifle to her shoulder, her aim steady, her purpose clear. The time for running was over. The time for fighting was now. You sent a man after me, and he turned around and quit rather than face me. I am giving you the same choice. Turn around and ride back. Leave Kansas forever. The deed stays in my name. Or stay and find out what a woman who has lost everything is willing to do to protect what she has left. You sent a man after me, and he turned around and quit rather than face me. I am giving you the same choice. Turn around and ride back. Leave Kansas forever. The deed stays in my name. Or stay and find out what a woman who has lost everything is willing to do to protect what she has left. Silence fell over the canyon. It was a heavy, suffocating silence, broken only by the nervous breathing of the horses. One of Dread's men glanced up at the limestone bluff, then at the man beside him. You could almost see One of Dread's men glanced up at the limestone bluff, then at the man beside him. You could almost see the mental math in his eyes, calculating whether his pay was really worth this. Was it worth dying for Silas Dread's greed? But Silas Dread sat still. He didn't move. He just looked up. He looked up at the woman he had dismissed as nothing, this widow he had burned out, this ghost he had chased across 3 states. And in her face he saw something he recognized instantly. He recognized it because it was the very thing he had built his entire life on, certainty, the absolute kind. The kind that cannot be bought, cannot be threatened away, cannot be broken. He had always been the one who had it. In every deal, in every fight, in every scorched earth campaign he waged, he was the one with that unshakable certainty. But standing there, in that narrow passage, with the sun beating down and the barrel of a rifle pointed his way, he knew. He was not the one who had it now. Slowly, deliberately, he turned his horse around. His men turned faster. Much faster. They moved with the palpable relief of people who have been given permission to finally make the sensible choice. The choice that lets them live another day. Sarah stayed on that bluff, watching them go. She watched until the cloud of dust they kicked up had settled, until the sound of their hoofbeats faded into nothing, until silence returned completely to the Kansas landscape. Only then did she lower her rifle. Only then did she allow herself to breathe. She rode back to Adi's trading post, her back straight, her mind clear. She walked through the door, and a small blur of motion came flying towards her. Grace, her daughter, hit her at full speed, wrapping both arms around her waist in a hug that was fierce and desperate and full of love. Sarah held her tight, burying her face in her daughter's hair, and for the first time in a long time, she felt the anchor of home. 3 months later, a letter arrived at the Federal Land Office. It was a very detailed letter, outlining every single crime Silas Dredd had ever committed in the territory. That same month, the Calloway farm deed was officially re-registered in Sarah's name. Silas Dredd left Kansas and was never seen again. Sarah rebuilt the farm. She did it one board at a time, one season at a time. With Grace by her side and the help of her friends, she raised the walls from the ashes. And as she worked, she discovered that she had been right all along. Love was enough to build a life on. But she also learned something new about love. Love, she now knew, was not always gentle. It wasn't just soft words and quiet moments. It was also the ferocious, stubborn thing that had kept her moving when everything inside her screamed to stop. It was the fire that had put her on that limestone bluff, armed with a rifle and a certainty that burned brighter than any fear. That was love too, the hard kind. The kind that stands its ground. The kind that outruns the devil. If this story moved you, if Sarah's courage touched something in your heart, please take one moment right now and hit that like button. Share this story with someone who needs to be reminded. Courage touched something in your heart, please take one moment right now and hit that like button. Share this story with someone who needs to be reminded that strength is not something you are born with, it is something life builds in you when it has no other choice. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story like this one. Every week we bring you tales of courage and heartbreak and redemption from the wild and beautiful American West. Turn on that notification bell so these stories find you. And leave a comment below. Tell us what moment in Sarah's journey hit you the hardest. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story like this one. Every week we bring you tales of courage and heartbreak and redemption from the wild and beautiful American West. Turn on that notification bell so these stories find you. And leave a comment below. Tell us what moment in Sarah's journey hit you the hardest.